Picking up from where we left off the last class, talking about diffusion, we had started chapter 3 of the text. We skipped chapter 2 at the moment. So we're talking about movement into and out of cells, and that would cover diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. And these processes are important, especially in multicellular organisms, which are very large, and so they cannot absorb nutrients and other required substances directly from their surroundings. So they consume food, or they breathe air, or they pass out urine, and right, the essential materials or the waste products are all exchanged in the body within cells, sorry, between cells, uh, via some right one or more than one of these processes working uh, at the same time. So diffusion is the net movement of particles of a substance from a region of their higher concentration to a region of their lower concentration down a concentration gradient as a result of random. So I gave the example yesterday of a smell spreading inside a room and then outside a room. And the reason behind that is the kinetic energy of the particles, and also right, the collision between particles of whatever substance is that smell belongs to, and for example, the particles of air or water or whatever liquids are mixing together or whatever gases are mixing together. So we talked about different scenarios of diffusion. You have two gases, you have two liquids, a liquid and a gas, a solid and a liquid perhaps, but it is only effective, where it is most effective in gases, less so in liquids, and doesn't happen within solids, and it's most effective over short distances, right? Otherwise, and it takes a very long time if you leave it on its own. So if there's nothing promoting the diffusion to occur, like you're not stirring, uh, if you've mixed liquids, you're not stirring the container, or there is no wind blowing, or you haven't turned on the fan in the room, so the gases, right, for them to spread would take a rather long time. So how does diffusion work in cells? It works for the exchange of materials such as carbon dioxide and oxygen, water and nutrients, and also, if I just add over here, waste products. So I just put that over there. Of course, right, CO2 is a waste product, but you've got other waste products such as urea, something we will come across later. Now, for a cell, it is right freely permeable. It allows the movement of right the cell membrane, as we studied, right, allows movement of substances like oxygen and carbon dioxide and water, right, into and out of the cell via diffusion. Right, so those are some things that are diffusing, and the whole point is perhaps right to, in some cases, right, balance the concentrations, right, on either side. But that in itself in a biological system would cause problems, and so right, there are mechanisms in place to keep the diffusion working. What are other scenarios where diffusion works? So gas exchange, again, carbon dioxide and oxygen in the lungs, the uptake of nutrients. So you are, for example, absorbing glucose in the small intestine, right? And to a certain extent, diffusion, what just happened, right? So this occurs via diffusion to some extent, right? In plants, right, diffusion of carbon dioxide into leaves, right, oxygen and water vapor out of leaves also occurs via diffusion. So it's happening everywhere, right? And also the uptake of nutrients from the soil, right? So enough about that. As I mentioned, at a certain point, uh, as diffusion occurs, the concentrations of whatever substance is uh, in question will become balanced. And so, right, for a living organism, that might not be a favorable situation, because if, for example, in the small intestine, glucose outside and inside the cells of the small intestine become balanced, and so there won't be any more uptake, and all the nutrition, and we're just talking about glucose, so fats and amino acids and other minerals like magnesium or zinc or sodium or whatever is required, it won't occur effectively, and so a good proportion of the nutrients will be lost because they won't be absorbed, because diffusion has maxed out, you could say, and that's it. Similarly for plants, right? Taking up nutrients from the soil, or gas exchange. We won't be able to provide oxygen as effectively if we rely simply on diffusion.
Like breathing is also a process of diffusion.
Huh?
It's also, breathing is also an example of diffusion.
What is example of diffusion?
Breathing, the process of inhaling.
Breathing. Okay, right. Breathing is the physical act of taking in and take letting out air. So inhalation and exhalation,
Uh,
right? That is breathing. It's a physical process. Respiration, right, break is the breakdown of glucose, right, in presence. Well, presence of oxygen is a different matter, to provide energy. And right, gas exchange is what you're talking about, which happens in the lungs. Obviously, it is dependent on inhalation, but that is happening between the air in the lungs and then the blood, right? So between lungs and blood. And so, right, that is where the carbon dioxide and the oxygen are exchanged between the blood and the lungs. Oxygen is taken in from the lungs, and carbon dioxide is given up to the lungs, and so expired or exhaled. Right, so breathing is not an example of diffusion. Gas exchanges.
Okay.
Now, right, what are the things that affect the rates of diffusion? So I want diffusion to continue, right? Because I want to absorb all the nutrients that are present in my food. I want to absorb the nutrients in the soil. I want to, continue the process of photosynthesis, or maximize the absorption of oxygen from the air in the lungs. Right. So, what are the factors affecting the rates of diffusion? And so, first up is the surface area. Right. And so, the more surface area, so the example they give is, right, if you have, let's say, a cell with a surface area of 1 millimeter square, and then you've got a cell of a surface area of 2 millimeters square. And so this is twice the surface area, right? So the rate of diffusion would, right, would be twice as much. So twice as much rate of diffusion as compared to the cell with the 1 millimeter square surface area. And so the more surface area that is available for diffusion to occur, right, the more uh, effectively it would happen. And so to maximize, right, the available surface area, in many cases you will see that some sort of, right there are foldings. So these are adaptations, you could say, foldings of membranes. So for example, you've got cells that are like right at one end, and these are the cells you would find in your small intestine, the microvilli, right? Instead of having a cell like this, right, you only have this much surface area. The one end of the membrane has multiple folds, and so all of this up and down and inside and outside, right, all of this greatly increases the surface area. For example, right, if this is 2 millimeters squared, this is probably like, I guess, 6 maybe, right? So that's even more than that, so it's times 3. So just as an example, right, obviously we're not doing the actual calculation, and so that provides even more. And how does surface area matter, right? So it's like, uh, you know a field with, uh, right, one gate present, and so, right, people can only enter the field through this gate. The rest is a wall, let's say, right? And to increase the surface area, you perhaps make the gate bigger, and so more people can enter from the available area, and so that would speed up diffusion. Just as an analogy, does that make sense?
No.
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 Do you need like more explanation?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take what kind of example should. Okay, let's say you have a circle. What is the available surface area? Surface, only the surface, right? This thing, right? But the part inside is not available, is it?
No.
Now, just an example, right? For understanding increased surface area, you cut this circle up into four parts, and you move it apart. Now, initially, only the circumference of the circle was available, right? But now you have the sides as well. And so, which of these two has more surface area?
The second one.
Exactly, right? And so, because there's more surface area available, first the inside, right? So, these sides, these sectors, the sides of the sectors that you've made of the circle, they weren't available before because they were inside the circle. But now that you've cut it into four pieces, you can cut it into any piece as much piece. Like you could just have two semicircles, right? Even if you have only two semicircles, right? This area that is now exposed wasn't there, wasn't available before. It was just the outside, and so you've got some of the inside area that is exposed as well, and so that is forming that is new surface area available for interaction, right? So in case of a cell, right? Again, for one thing, a cell that becomes larger, a larger cell will have more surface area, but cells are usually small, right? And so there are certain physical adaptations as the microvilli, right? Or we would see in mitochondria that the inner membrane is very much folded, and so instead of just having plain, borders, they go loop around, and so increase, right, the area like this. The cell is not breaking up. This is just an example. You're not breaking up the cell to provide more surface area, right? And so there's just more surface. There is more surface available, right, for particles to pass through. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Right. Also, an example, right, similar to this is the shape of the cell matters. Right. So, for example, you have like a ball of dough, right? So you got a ball of dough, and then you take a rolling pin and you flatten it up, It's the same dough, right? First it was just like this mass. Now you flattened it out. Which one has more surface area, the ball or the flat?
The flattened one.
Exactly, right? And so the shape of the cell, right? If it's just a cell that's like that, or if it's a cell that is flat, like that, right? The volume of the cells are the same, right? So you got the same volume, but the surface area has increased, and so the diffusion will be far more effective. The rate of diffusion will be higher in the flattened cell, right, as compared to the round cell. Okay.
Yeah.
Then you've got temperature. So, right, diffusion depends is due to the kinetic energy of particles. So when the temperature goes up, right, the kinetic energy of particles also increases. And when the kinetic energy increases, right, they move about more, they're going to have more diffusion. Straightforward. Any questions there?
No.
Okay. Then you have concentration gradient. So the concentration gradient is basically the difference in concentration, right, between the two sides and the concentration. In this case, we can generally say inside and outside the cell, right? So the greater the difference in concentration, the greater the gradient, right? So if you got, for example, 100 over here, only 10 over here, that's a difference of 90. And so particles will move much more faster as opposed to if you've got 60 and 40. They will move, but the rate they'll be slower because there's already a decent number over here, right? So we just need to transfer 10 as opposed to having to transfer, uh, you know, 45 or something, right? So the greater the gradient and therefore the greater the rate of diffusion. Now over here, this is where we talked about, in the small intestine or the, gas exchange or even filtration in the kidneys, all of the things that we will talk about later. Uh, that diffusion would come to a stop after a certain time. Well, in biological systems, right, a diffusion gradient is usually maintained, right? And one major player for this is blood flow. So you've got blood in your body, in your blood vessels, right? If, for example, in the smallest intestine, right? You're absorbing amino acids, right, which are what proteins are made of, which is what we'll talk about in the next chapter. And right, the concentration outside and inside becomes equal. It balances, and so no more diffusion will take place. But these amino acids are being taken into blood vessels. They're being right, so they're absorbed into blood vessels, and the blood flows away from that part. And so the new blood that's coming in, right, has a low concentration of amino acids, and so that would keep diffusion working.
So, like in our body, diffusion is happening constantly.
Yes, constant in the sense like if you haven't eaten anything and there's nothing in your stomach, you haven't eaten anything for 6 hours, everything's digested, then there's no diffusion happening in that case, right?
Oh,
But depending on uh, right where in the body you're talking about. For example, gas exchange. As long as you are alive, gas exchange is constantly happening. So that's the same thing, right? Air into the lungs, right? There's blood in the vessels in the lungs,
yeah,
right? They take up oxygen and give up CO2, right? Blood flows. New blood, right? Again, takes in oxygen, right? Gives up CO2, and that process continues. And then breathing out of which is also very important, right? Because all that carbon dioxide that is accumulating in the air in your lungs, you can't like, right? That is why you can't hold your breath for very long on purpose, right? Like you can't do it for very long if you're holding it yourself. And if someone is, holding your breath for you, then, right, obviously not a good, right? You will, if you're not allowed to breathe, then you will start suffocating. Why? Because you don't have oxygen coming in. Your body needs oxygen. The carbon dioxide is building up in your lungs and your body, and that is a dangerous situation, right? And so that process of diffusion is constantly happening, and even the kidneys, right? So filtration in the kidneys happens via diffusion, right? And then later due to active transport, which we'll talk about after osmosis. Any questions?
no,
Clear so far?
yeah,
Just a sec. All good. Okay. And right then distance. So the distance over which diffusion is occurring. And so cell membranes are about 0.007 micrometers thick. How much is 0.007 micrometers? It is right 7 into 10 to the power 9 meters, right? Or if you want to convert it into millimeters, it is only so into 1000, right? Just a second. A bit confused. So to make it more understandable, this is micrometers, and so how many millimeters is that? That is 0.0000007 millimeters. Or if you want to convert it to centimeters, you add another zero. That's how thin cell membranes are. Okay. And so, as I mentioned, diffusion is only effective over very short distances. And when you've got only that much, diffusion will work. Right? So the cell, and even if particles have to pass through the entire cells, the thickness of the cells is also right. They're flattened out in many cases, right? So, and steep concentration gradients, as we talked about, and so right, it all promotes diffusion to carry on. With that, right, we come to an end to diffusion, and we're going to move into osmosis. Any questions about diffusion?
You know, like the food particles spread throughout the whole room too. वो तो distance बहुत ज़्यादा होता है ना?
Yes, but in that case, as I mentioned, right, if there is if your fan is switched off, right, if your fan is switched off and you are not waving your hands in the air to disturb the particles, and just like if you leave them on their own, then it would, unless there's like a very concentrated smell, like you broke a bottle of perfume and there's like too much of it coming, right? And so that would create a very large, or as you would say, a steep concentration gradient. Let's just go back and add the word steep over here. So this is a steep concentration gradient, right? And so maybe that will put an effect. If it's hot, the temperature will cause, increase the rate of diffusion, but still it would take a considerable time for the smell to reach the, if it's a large room, or outside the room or the other side of the house, it would take time on its own. And so in the body, diffusion is being affected by temperature. It is being affected by the very, the large surface areas available. It is being affected by maintaining a concentration gradient, right? And it is being affected by the very short distances over which it has to occur. So the system inside the body is tuned to maximize the rate of diffusion, right?
Okay.
That is not something that you would find it, like, of course, if you switch on the fan, then whatever smell it is will quickly spread through the, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Or if you put perfume on your clothes and you're sitting in the corner of the room, same thing. But if you start moving around the house, then you are taking the perfume with you, and you are taking the particles of the perfume with you, and so obviously they will spread everywhere you are going, right?
Yeah.
All right, next up we have osmosis. And basically, osmosis is a special case of diffusion. And it involves only water molecules. Right, so as a definition, osmosis is the net movement, you highlight that, net movement of water molecules from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential through a partially permeable membrane. So partially permeable membrane. So these are some things that we need to talk about. Now the term net movement was also used for diffusion. If we go back to the definition, right, the net movement of particles. So what do they mean by net movement? Well, right, you have the cell membrane, right? This is inside the cell and this is outside the cell. And this is a particle, whether it's water or something else, right? So whether we talk about diffusion or osmosis, you've got particles over here and you've got particles over here. So, right, actually particles are moving in and out all the time, right? They're not going to stop. Even in the case of diffusion, when the concentrations balance on both sides, the particles will continue to move in and out. Why? Because they have kinetic energy. But what net movement means is basically, right, you check where the movement has occurred more. Where the movement has occurred more. So, right, in this case, how many particles are moving in? Like the arrows I've drawn.
3 particles.
Four actually. One, two, three, four. Right, so four particles are moving in. And how many particles are moving out?
2.
Two are moving out. And so the net movement is two moving out, moving in. Right, because four moved in, two moved out. So what is the total? Right, we can do this by simple math if you want. 4 minus 2 is 2, right? And so a total of actual movement, the actual difference that was made was two particles moving into the cell. That is what it means by net movement. So when the concentrations are balanced on both sides, right? So when the concentrations are balanced, particles are still moving, but there is no net movement, meaning, right, the number of particles moving in is almost equal to or exactly equal to the number moving out. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have to talk about water potential. So water potential is basically a special term or a specific term for the concentration of water molecules. Right, so if you've got more water molecules over here and less over here, normally you would say there's a high concentration on the left, which is true, but in the case of water, you will say that there's a higher, what would you say? Water potential. And over here, there's a low concentration. In case of water, so in case of when you talk about osmosis, you will not say the concentration of water molecules. You will say there is a lower water potential. All right. Hello. Oh, did you miss much? No. No. Right. Welcome back. Did you miss much of my explanation? Wait, why is it not showing the next slide? Let me reshare my screen. Okay. So I was explaining, right, what the term water potential, and that's basically a specific term for the concentration of water molecules. So instead of saying high concentration of water molecules and low concentration water molecules, which you would have said in the case of diffusion, so high concentration of glucose, low concentration of glucose, high concentration of oxygen, low concentration of oxygen. For water, instead of saying high concentration, you will say high water potential, and for instead of saying low concentration, you would say low water potential. Just because, just like you're using a specific term for the diffusion of water itself, instead of saying diffusion of water, you're saying osmosis. You also are using, instead of high and low concentration, you're using high and low water potential. And then we're going to talk about partially permeable membrane. Right, so a membrane is a barrier, right, between anything. Right, in this case, we are talking about the cell membrane. Squeeze that in here. And then permeability. So what does permeable mean? Permeable means, right,
Yeah,
allowing,
certain things.
no, to be permeable means allowing, right, particles to move across or pass through. Right, and partially means it is selective, right, so it does not allow to pass through freely. I should add that. So it does not allow all particles to move across freely. Right, and so the cell surface membrane or the cell membrane of a cell is a partially permeable membrane. right? How does that matter? It matters because, right, the environment inside your body is aqueous, which means there's a lot of water everywhere. How much water is there? Right? Cells are about 75% water. That's a lot, right? Blood plasma is right about 92% water, which is even more. But that means that there, right? Water is a solvent. You understand what solvent? Karan, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So water is a solvent, and 75% water or 92% water means that there are solutes present as well. So a solvent is a liquid in which other substances dissolve, right? And solutes are the substances that dissolve, right? And so there's solutes present. So, right, what the cell membrane does is that it freely allows water to pass through. So water freely moves across the membrane, whereas the solutes are restricted. Some can move freely, others, right, are selective. And right, they are selective, perhaps they're not allowed to move across the membrane at all, or perhaps they're only specific parts of the membrane from where they can move, right? So there's some sort of selection going on over there in case of solids. And so how that helps, I'll use this space over here instead of squeezing it down below. How that helps is, right, so we're talking about the concentration of water, right? We said cells is 75% water, blood is 92% water. And so you have the cell membrane over here, right? This is inside the cell and this is outside the cell, right? You've got water, obviously, and then you've got, right, enzymes and proteins and, other, glucose and mineral ions and, right, a lot of that in the cell as well. On the outside, you got a lot of water, right? The blood, the tissue fluid. What's the tissue fluid will come to. So, and then you've got, some glucose over here, maybe some amino acids, but they're fewer. And so what would happen is, right, the water molecules, which are just these dots that I put in, right? These water molecules, there are more water molecules on the outside than the inside, meaning that the outside has a higher water potential, right? And so they move in freely, and right, they increase the number of water molecules inside. As for the glucose and amino acids and enzymes or whatever else is out there, whether or not they're able to pass in depends, right? Maybe you've got sodium ions, fluoride ions, potassium ions, right? Can these guys move in? Yes, they can by diffusion. Are they always allowed to move in? No, right? So, right, that is the partial permeable or selective nature of the cell membrane. Any
Like
questions?
it is irrelevant to the topic, but like do our cells also have blood inside them?
No, cells do not have blood. The thing is, perhaps you're asking because if you get a cut anywhere, you're going to get blood. And that is because the vasculature, as I mentioned, I believe, yesterday's class, right? The network of blood vessels is so extensive throughout your body, and blood vessels include, right? You've got, so if I just put a box over here, right? You've got the larger ones which are the arteries and veins, but you've got capillaries, which are those, right? Smaller ones. In some cases, these capillaries can be microscopic. They can be that small, right? So, in fact, capillaries are microscopic, right? You can't normally see capillaries just going around, right? If you're able to see them, you're probably seeing. So, if you get a cut or a bruise or a scratch anywhere, and you immediately see either the skin reddening, which basically means blood is flowing over there, right? And that red color is because of the blood. Or when you're blushing, or when you're feeling hot and your skin becomes red, your face becomes red when you're feeling hot, that's because more blood is flowing. And so the network of blood vessels is so extensive throughout the body that, right, it like if you remove anything, most likely you're going to get blood as well, because you're going to damage a blood vessel and blood is going to leak out, unless you're perhaps removing just the top layer of your skin, right? So maybe there's directly, there's a bit distance over there, so maybe you can scratch some skin cells, or maybe you can, get some cells of the lining of your mouth without causing a bleed, right? But yeah. Anything else?
No.
Okay, can I manage something, right, in the few minutes that we have? So, right, why is talking about water so important? It's very important, as I mentioned, right? The majority of our bodies is water. Like we are anywhere between 65 to 75% water ourselves, maybe a bit more depending on our metabolism. And right, there are a lot of substances that travel in solution in the body, in the blood vessels, such as hormones and enzymes, as I mentioned, hormones, enzymes, right? O2 and CO2, and amino acids and ions, right? And other things. And I talked
Mm,
about the fact that osmosis is basically the diffusion of water. So I've talked about that, right? A concentration gradient, or in this case, right, the term you want to use instead of concentration gradient. So we use that for diffusion, right? Where is the definition? Okay. What you want to use is water potential gradient. Okay, so just terms that are specific to the process of osmosis. The concept is the same as diffusion, right? But some of the applications within the body, which we'll talk about next time, are different, right? So how animal cells and plant cells react to different environments where there's more or less water, how osmosis is important to plants specifically. And along with that, we will quickly cover active transport. So I guess just one more class, hopefully, to cover this chapter. I
mm,
was, I guess, hoping to cover it today, but maybe I spent a bit more time explaining. I don't know. All right. So aim is next class we will finish this chapter and then move on to chapter 4, which is biological molecules. All right.
yeah.
So yeah, do read the book, follow along, and I'll see you next time, inshallah.
Allah.
Allah.